60 seconds. That was the exact window Caitlin Stewart had to decide if she would remain a ghost or become a target. 1 minute to choose between the safety of her quiet, struggling life and the violent world of a man who didn't even know she existed. The Sapphire Gala was a sea of shimmering silk and diamond-encrusted champagne flutes. As a waitress, Caitlin was part of the furniture, a shadow in a crisp white shirt and black vest, moving silently through the crowd of Los Angeles' most dangerous elites. She was trained to be invisible, to see everything and say nothing. But then, she passed the heavy velvet curtains of the VIP corridor and heard it. The neurotoxin is active. The dragon falls in 60 seconds. No witnesses. The words weren't in English. They were in the sharp, rhythmic Busan dialect of Korean, the same tongue her father had whispered to her during his years stationed overseas, the language of her childhood. Caitlin froze. Through the cracked door, she saw him, Jung Sang-ho, the man they called the Dragon, slumped against a marble pillar, his powerful frame failing as the poison took hold. 2 men in tuxedos were drawing silencers, their faces cold stone. She couldn't run. If they saw her, she was dead. If they found him like this, he was dead. With her heart hammering like a trapped bird, Caitlin dropped her tray. The crash of glass echoed, and before the assassins could turn the corner, she threw herself into the alcove. She grabbed the semi-conscious mafia boss by his lapels and pulled his face to hers. As the hitmen rounded the corner, they didn't see an assassination. They saw a passionate, private moment between a waitress and a powerful man. She kissed him to save his life, never realizing that for the dragon, a kiss was more dangerous than a bullet. The morning after the gala didn't bring the relief of survival. It brought the cold, sharp edge of reality. Caitlin stood in the manager's office of the Sapphire Tower, her hands trembling behind her back as Mr. Henderson stared at her with a look of pure loathing. The opulent office, with its panoramic view of Los Angeles, felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Unprofessional conduct doesn't even begin to cover it, Caitlin, Henderson spat, tossing a grainy printed still from a security feed onto the mahogany desk. It was the moment in the corridor. Caitlin, a lowly waitress, pinned against the marble by the most dangerous man in the city, their lips locked in what looked like a scandalous tryst. You were hired to serve appetizers, not the guests. To do this, with a man of Jung Sang-ho's reputation, you've single-handedly jeopardized our contract with the most powerful families in the Pacific Rim. Mr. Henderson, you don't understand, Caitlin began, her voice cracking. She couldn't tell him about the neurotoxin or the men with silencers. Who would believe a girl who spent her shifts clearing shrimp tails? He was in trouble. I was trying to. You were trying to social climb in the most disgusting way possible, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I've already called the agency. You aren't just fired, Caitlin. I've made sure your name is flagged across every high-end catering firm from here to Malibu. You're done in this city. The walk home felt miles longer than usual. The neon lights of the city, usually so vibrant, now felt like mocking eyes. When she stepped into her cramped apartment, the smell of antiseptic hit her, the scent of her sister's struggle. Chloe was asleep in the adjustable bed that took up half the living room, her breathing rhythmic and assisted by the hum of an oxygen concentrator. Caitlin sat at the small kitchen table and opened her laptop, her heart sinking as she logged into the patient portal for the St. Jude Neurological Center. The red text glared back at her, past due. The balance for Chloe's upcoming surgery was a mountain she could no longer climb. Without her job, without the specialized tips from the gala circuit, the specialized physical therapy would stop by the end of the week. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She had saved a dragon and, in return, she had burned her own world to the ground. As a single tear traced a path through the fading makeup on her cheek, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Her breath hitched. In the shadows of her doorway, She realized for the first time that the black vest she'd worn wasn't just a uniform, it was the shroud of the life she used to know. The fall from grace was over. The nightmare was just beginning. The sterile silence of the private clinic was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator. Jung Sang-ho's eyes snapped open, the pupils blown wide as his body surged against the silk restraints of the recovery bed. His lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, a lingering reminder of the neurotoxin that had nearly paralyzed his heart. Every muscle in his jaw throbbed, and his blood felt sluggish, thick with the chemical dregs of the attempted assassination. As the fog of the sedative retreated, a singular, burning memory solidified in his mind. Not the face of the gunman, but the woman. He remembered the weight of her hands on his lapels, the smell of cheap jasmine perfume, and the startling heat of her lips against his. To the world, it had been a moment of passion. To him, it was a blurred hallucination of golden-brown skin and a gaze that held his with terrifying intensity right before his world went black. In his line of work, a woman's touch was never a coincidence. It was a weapon. The dragon had been brought to his knees not by a bullet, but by a waitress with a siren's kiss. When his lieutenant, Minute Jun, stepped into the room, the air pressure seemed to drop. Sang-ho didn't wait for a status report. He ripped the 4-line from his arm, a bead of dark blood blooming on his skin. He spoke through gritted teeth, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that promised a storm. The woman at the gala. The one in the service corridor. Minute Jun bowed his head, his face a mask of practiced efficiency. "We are searching, boss. Security says she was a temp, Caitlin Stewart. She disappeared into the crowd after the chaos. We believe she was the delivery mechanism for the toxin." Sang-ho leaned forward, the shadows of the dimly lit clinic carving his features into a mask of cold fury. He didn't care about the logistics or the protocol. He felt the phantom pressure of her mouth on his, a memory he now interpreted as a mark of ownership and betrayal. If she was the one who had poisoned him, she would be the one to watch him recover, right before he broke her. "I don't want a search," Sang-ho commanded, his fingers curling into a fist that shook with the effort of his recovery. "I want her here. Use every shadow, every informant, and every camera in this city. If she is breathing, I want her brought to me in chains. No one touches the dragon and walks away. Find her, and bring her to my penthouse. I want to see the light leave her eyes when she realizes who she tried to kill." The rain began as a drizzle, turning the grime of the Los Angeles pavement into a slick, oil-stained mirror. Caitlin pulled her threadbare hoodie tighter, her shoulder bag heavy with the weight of unpaid medical notices and a half-eaten sandwich. She was 3 blocks from the bus stop, her mind looping through calculations of how many shifts she could pull at a 24-hour diner if she worked under a fake name. She was so focused on the math of survival that she didn't notice the black sedan idling at the curb until the door creaked open. 2 men stepped out, their faces obscured by the shadows of low-slung caps. They didn't look like the police, and they certainly didn't look like creditors. They moved with the predatory grace of professional killers. One reached into his jacket, the unmistakable glint of a suppressed pistol catching the yellow glow of a street lamp. Caitlin's heart stopped. She backed away, her heel catching on a cracked paving stone, but before she could scream, the air was shattered by the screech of tires. A silver SUV roared onto the sidewalk, forcing the assassins to dive for cover. A second group of men, dressed in tactical black with the insignia of a coiled dragon hidden on their lapels, swarmed out with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't a rescue. It was a harvest. The 2 hitmen were neutralized in a flurry of silenced gunfire and blunt force, their bodies dragged into the shadows as if they had never existed. Caitlin turned to run, but a hand like a vice gripped her upper arm. "Miss Stewart," a voice cold as a winter grave whispered in her ear. "The dragon is waiting." Before she could draw breath to protest, a black hood was pulled over her head, plunging her world into suffocating velvet. The ride was silent, marked only by the sharp turns and the hum of a high-powered engine. When the hood was finally ripped away, the sudden glare of a single industrial bulb blinded her. She was zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of a cavernous, refrigerated warehouse. The air was thick with the scent of frozen meat and ozone. Every breath she took came out as a white plume of frost. Her teeth began to chatter, not just from the biting cold, but from the sight of the man stepping out of the darkness. Jung Sang-ho didn't look like a man who had been dying 48 hours ago. He looked like a god of vengeance, his tailored suit flawless, his eyes fixed on her with a predatory curiosity that made her skin crawl. He walked a slow circle around her, the heels of his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete like the ticking of a clock. He stopped directly in front of her, leaning down until she could feel the heat radiating from his body against the chill of the room. He didn't speak, he simply watched her, waiting for the terror to break her before the questioning even began. The cold of the warehouse was a physical weight, pressing against Caitlin's lungs until every breath felt like inhaling needles. Jung Sang-ho moved with the silent, terrifying grace of a predator, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the concrete floor. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and withdrew a sleek, folding knife. The click of the blade locking into place sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous space. He didn't look like a man seeking answers. He looked like a man seeking an ending. He pressed the tip of the steel beneath her chin, forcing her head back until she had no choice but to meet his icy, obsidian gaze. "Who sent you?" he rasped, his voice vibrating with a lethal undercurrent. "Which family paid a waitress to deliver a death sentence in a kiss? Was it the Soto clan? Or did my own board of directors decide I had lived too long?" Caitlin's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of pure terror. She could feel the sharp sting of the blade piercing the surface of her skin. She tried to speak in English, to explain the gala, the corridor, the men she'd seen, but her throat was tight with a sob. She looked at him, seeing not just the monster the world feared, but the dying man she had held in the dark. As his grip tightened on the knife, a dormant instinct, buried under years of living as an invisible servant in America, surged to the surface. She didn't think, she reacted in the language of her father, the language of the rough coastal streets she had once called home. "I wasn't the one who poisoned you, you arrogant fool," she screamed, the words tumbling out in the harsh, rhythmic cadence of the Busan dialect. The men in the tuxedos, they were the ones with the silver vials. "I heard them talking about the neurotoxin. I didn't kiss you to kill you. I kissed you because they were coming to finish the job and I had to hide your face." The blade stopped. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Sang-ho's eyes widened, the murderous fire momentarily extinguished by a look of profound, jarring shock. He didn't pull the knife away, but the pressure vanished. He stared at her, his gaze scanning her features as if seeing her for the very first time. To hear that specific, localized dialect, not the polished Seoul accent of the elite, but the grit of the docks, coming from a black waitress in a Los Angeles warehouse was an impossibility that shattered his reality. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" he whispered, his voice no longer a threat but a question layered with a strange, haunting familiarity. Caitlin took a shuddering breath, her eyes defiant even through the tears. "My father was stationed there for 10 years. He didn't just bring back stories, Sang-ho. He brought back a language. I knew what those men were saying. I knew you were the dragon they were trying to slay. I saved your life, and this is how you thank me." Sang-ho stood slowly, the knife still held in a white-knuckled grip, but his eyes remained locked on hers. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a shifting tide. The prey had just spoken the language of the predator, and in that moment, the hunt changed forever. The transition from the freezing warehouse to the suffocating luxury of the dragon's penthouse was a blur of motion and silence. Caitlin sat on a velvet sofa that likely cost more than her childhood home, her fingers still trembling as they curled around a glass of warm tea. The apartment was a fortress of glass and steel perched above the shimmering veins of Los Angeles, a place where the air felt thin and expensive. Across from her, Sang-ho had discarded his jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and ink. He wasn't looking at her as a victim anymore. He was looking at her as a map. For 3 days, the penthouse became a war room. They sat side by side in front of a wall of high-definition monitors, scrolling through the digital ghosts of the Sapphire Gala. Sang-ho's presence was a physical heat, a constant reminder of the life-or-death proximity they had shared in that corridor. Every time his hand brushed hers to pause the footage, a jolt of electricity, sharp and dangerous, shot up her arm. It wasn't just fear. It was the terrifying thrill of being seen by a man who saw through everyone. "There," Caitlin whispered, her voice rasping as she pointed to a flickering screen. The man with the silver cufflinks. He wasn't security. He didn't have an earpiece, but he was the one who signaled the waiters to move the service carts. Sang-ho leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could smell the sandalwood of his cologne and the faint, metallic scent of the medicine still in his system. He watched the screen, his jaw tightening as he recognized the figure. "That is the head of my logistics team. A man I've trusted for a decade." He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes searching hers. "You have a gift for seeing what others ignore, Caitlin Stewart. Is that what happens when you spend your life being invisible?" The question held a weight that made her breath hitch. For the first time, the dragon wasn't a myth or a monster. He was a man surrounded by shadows, looking for a light he could trust. The tension in the room shifted, stretching tight like a wire about to snap. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the unspoken reality of the kiss that had started it all, a moment meant to be a lie that was becoming the only truth they had. "I learned to watch because it was the only way to stay safe," she replied softly, meeting his gaze. "Just like you." Sang-ho reached out, his thumb tracing the faint red mark the knife had left on her neck. It was a gesture of ownership, but his touch was unexpectedly gentle. "In my world, safety is a fantasy," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "But perhaps, for the first time, I don't want to be alone in the dark." The screens continued to flicker, revealing more faces of the betrayal, but the real storm was brewing within the 4 walls of the penthouse. They were no longer just a mob boss and a witness. They were 2 survivors building an alliance on the edge of a blade, and the heat rising between them was more volatile than any neurotoxin. The fragile sanctuary of the penthouse shattered with the ping of a single notification. Caitlin was sitting at the marble kitchen island, the steam from her coffee mingling with the cool air of the high-rise, when her phone screen illuminated with a message from an unknown sender. It was a video file. Her thumb hovered over the glass, a cold dread pooling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The footage was grainy, taken in a dimly lit, cramped space that smelled of damp concrete and stagnant air. Caitlin's breath hitched, then stopped entirely. There was Chloe. Her sister was still strapped into her wheelchair, her head lolling to the side, her eyes wide with a terror that she couldn't voice. She was in a room that looked like a shipping container, the rhythmic hum of her oxygen concentrator replaced by the hollow whistling of the wind. A hand clad in a black leather glove entered the frame, tilting Chloe's chin up with a cruel, dismissive flick. Then came the voice, smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of mercy. Minute-Jun didn't need to show his face. His tone carried the weight of a death sentence. The dragon has a new pet, he murmured in English, his words dripping with venom. But pets are replaceable. Sisters are not. You saved his life with a kiss, Caitlin. Now, you will take it with a needle. The camera panned down to a small, velvet-lined box resting on a rusted table. Inside sat a single syringe filled with a clear, shimmering liquid, the same neurotoxin that had almost claimed Sang-ho at the gala. Doc 7. Midnight. Minute-Jun continued. Bring him to the water's edge. Inject him while he sleeps, or the girl stops breathing. You have 6 hours to decide which life is worth more. Caitlin dropped the phone, the glass screen spiderwebbing against the marble. The room seemed to tilt, the glittering skyline of Los Angeles turning into a blurred cage of light. She felt a presence behind her, the silent, heavy heat of Sang-ho. He had seen it. He stood like a statue carved from shadow, his eyes fixed on the cracked screen. For the first time since she had met him, the dragon looked truly vulnerable, not because of a poison, but because of the reflection of Caitlin's agony in his own eyes. She turned to him, her face ashen, her voice a ghost of a sound. The choice was impossible, the man who had become her protector, or the sister who was her soul. Minute-Jun hadn't just attacked his boss, he had weaponized Caitlin's heart, forcing her into a game where every move ended in blood. The alliance was no longer a secret war of data and monitors. It was a countdown to a betrayal that would leave no survivors. The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of ozone and unspoken goodbyes as Caitlin stood before Sang-ho, the cracked phone still clutched in her hand. She didn't hide the video. She didn't whisper the threat. She laid the agony of her choice bare, showing him the footage of Chloe's terror. For a long moment, the dragon was silent, his gaze fixed on the shimmering city lights that suddenly looked like cold, distant stars. He didn't erupt in fury. Instead, a chilling, calculated stillness settled over him. He looked at the vial of neurotoxin Minute-Jun had sent and then at Caitlin, reaching out to cup her face with a hand that was steady as stone. They didn't speak of betrayal. They spoke of a counterstrike, hatching a desperate gamble in the quiet language of the boson docks. Midnight at Dock 7 arrived with a funeral hush. The Pacific Ocean slapped against the rotted wooden pilings, and the fog rolled in like a heavy shroud, smelling of salt and rust. Caitlin stepped out of the shadows, her frame trembling with a performance fueled by genuine terror. Behind her, slumped in the back seat of a black sedan, was Sang-ho. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored, his head lolling against the leather in a perfect mimicry of the paralysis Caitlin had seen at the gala. Minute-Jun emerged from the gloom of a skeletal crane, flanked by 4 men with high-caliber rifles. He looked at the scene with a smirk of pure, predatory triumph. "The waitress finds her sting," he mocked, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal of nearby shipping containers. He gestured for his men to check the body. They pulled Sang-ho from the car, his heavy frame dead weight in their arms, and dropped him onto the cold, damp concrete at Minute-Jun's feet. Caitlin stood her ground, her eyes darting toward the darkened entrance of a nearby warehouse where she hoped Chloe was being held. "I did what you asked," she rasped, her voice cracking with the strain of the lie. "Now give me my sister. You have the dragon. He's yours. Just let her go." Minute-Jun stepped over Sang-ho's motionless form, reaching out to stroke the glass of the empty syringe Caitlin held out as proof. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound that was swallowed by the fog. "You played your part beautifully, Caitlin. It's a shame you won't live to see the new era." He signaled to his men, the click of safeties being disengaged cutting through the night. Caitlin's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at Sang-ho, praying that the placebo they had swapped for the toxin would hold, and that the dragon was merely waiting for the perfect moment to breathe fire. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the docks were about to become a slaughterhouse. The silence of the docks was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the sharp, metallic snap of a trap springing shut. As Minute-jun raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger, the corpse at his feet surged with the explosive violence of a coiled spring. Sang-ho didn't just wake, he erupted. The placebo had kept his blood clean, and the hours of feigned paralysis had only served to stoke the furnace of his rage. In one fluid motion, Sang-ho swept Minute-jun's legs out from under him. The traitor fell hard against the damp concrete, the breath hitching in his throat as the man he thought he had murdered stood over him like a god of vengeance. At that exact moment, the darkness of the surrounding shipping containers came alive. Red laser dots danced across the chests of Minute-jun's hitmen, and the fog was torn apart by the blinding white light of tactical flashes. Sang-ho's loyalists, who had been ghosting Caitlin's movements since she left the penthouse, swarmed the dock with surgical precision. "You thought you could use her?" Sang-ho's voice was a low, terrifying growl that cut through the sounds of the skirmish. He didn't use a gun. He reached down, hauling Minute-jun up by his collar until they were eye to eye. The traitor's face, once a mask of smug triumph, was now a map of pure, unadulterated terror. "You thought you could weaponize the only thing in this world that is untainted." Caitlin didn't wait to see the end. She sprinted toward the warehouse at the edge of the pier, guided by the muffled sound of a rhythmic hum, Chloe's oxygen concentrator. She threw open the heavy steel door to find her sister, terrified but unharmed, guarded by a man who was already dropping his weapon in surrender to the tactical team flooding in behind her. She collapsed into the chair, sobbing as she unbuckled Chloe's restraints, pulling her sister's small frame into her arms. Back on the pier, the fire of the dragon's wrath reached its peak. Sang-ho watched as his men disarmed the last of the rebels, but his focus remained entirely on Minute-jun. There was no trial, no negotiation. In the shadows of the rusted cranes, Sang-ho delivered a final, brutal justice that ensured the betrayal would never be repeated. When the smoke cleared and the screams faded into the salt air, Sang-ho turned away from the blood-stained concrete. He walked toward the warehouse, his gait heavy but certain. He found Caitlin on the floor, cradling Chloe, and for the first time, the lethal sharpness in his eyes softened. He reached out a hand, stained with the cost of his crown, and waited for her to take it. The war for the docks was over, but the fire they had walked through together had forged something far more dangerous than an alliance. The aftermath of the docks felt less like a victory and more like a rebirth. Within 48 hours, the suffocating weight of poverty that had defined Caitlin's existence was systematically dismantled by the dragon's reach. The red ink on the hospital portal vanished, replaced by a balance of 0 and a notification that Chloe had been moved to a private recovery wing with the best neurosurgeons in the country. The debt was gone, but the bond that had been forged in the salt spray and gunfire was only beginning to settle. Caitlin stood on the glass-walled balcony of the penthouse, the wind whipping her hair as she looked down at the city. She was no longer wearing the white shirt and black vest of a servant. She wore emerald silk that moved like liquid against her skin. Behind her, the door slid open. Sang-ho stepped out, his presence no longer a threat but a grounding force. He stood beside her, his gaze not on the city, but on the profile of the woman who had saved him twice. He reached into his pocket and placed a small velvet box on the railing. Inside was a key made of platinum, engraved with a dragon coiled around a rose. "The house in the valley is ready for Chloe," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual lethal edge. "The medical trust is fully funded. You could take her there tonight. You could disappear back into the world, live a life where no one knows your name, and never see a gun or a shadow again. You've earned your invisibility back, Caitlin." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers for a flicker of hesitation. "Or, you stay. You stay by my side, not as a witness or a waitress, but as the only person in this city I trust. You would be the dragon's heart, and that is a dangerous, beautiful thing." Caitlin looked at the key, then at the man who had seen her when she was a ghost. She thought of the years she had spent being walked over, ignored, and discarded by people who didn't know her strength. She thought of the Busan dialect she had kept hidden like a secret weapon. She didn't reach for the key to the valley. Instead, she turned to Sang-ho and placed her hand over his, her fingers steady and certain. "I'm tired of being invisible," she whispered, her voice ringing with a newfound power that made the dragon smile. As she stepped back into the penthouse, she wasn't just entering a room, she was stepping into a reign. The transition was complete. The waitress was dead, and in her place stood a woman who had walked through fire and found that she was the flame. The city below continued to glitter, unaware that its new queen had arrived, and that for Caitlin Stewart, the most dangerous story was the one she was finally writing for herself.